Hello, and welcome to our Monday Supper. I'm Camille Vasca, Mike's wife. Each week, we invite you into our home to discuss the issues that are important to our state and to our communities. This week, we'll talk about how we move forward from protests to solutions after the end of the CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. We're joined this week by former Washington Governor and U.S. Senator Dan Evans. Hello, Dan. And we welcome James Donaldson, who played basketball for WSU and the Seattle SuperSonics. After James retired from the sport, he moved to Seattle, where he's been involved in business and politics. Now, I'll turn it over to our family's favorite candidate for Attorney General, my husband, Mike Vasca.
Thank you, Camille. Still the favorite, 14 weeks running. Well, I hope you had a great 4th of July weekend. On today's show, we will talk about how to move past the CHAZ, beyond the protests, and toward building a safer and more just society. What happened on July 4th, 1776 can teach us a few things. On that day, a list of grievances was finalized to be sent to the British King. The Declaration of Independence was a protest document, a protest against unjust policies of a far-off government. But the document was also much more, as it laid out a set of solutions and a vision for a more just society. It was adopted by leaders from all the 13 colonies, each of whom had the ability to carry forward the plan to their communities. Our founding fathers protested. They had a plan. They had leadership. This is a time-tested formula for positive change in our country. Now a few words about the end of the CHAZ. An early morning police sweep last week ended the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. The end came after several weeks of murders, violent crime, and the loss of civil liberties by the small businesses and inhabitants of that 6-block area in Seattle. One of our guests tonight, James Donaldson, visited and video blogged from within the CHAZ, and you may recall that I visited the CHAZ a few days after it was formed as well. The CHAZ placed the kind of media spotlight on Seattle and our state that nobody wants. The CHAZ became a symbol of a widespread belief by our citizens that we are losing control of our communities. As I've said on this program before, the CHAZ was really just an exclamation point on a story that has been building for several years. The attempt to create a police-free zone in the CHAZ had another consequence. It diverted attention from the very real need to address racial injustice in our communities and in our country. The good news is that support for this national conversation and for action is emerging from groups across the political spectrum. For example, evangelical religious leaders, including Dr. Joel Castleberry of Kirkland, have launched an effort to address violence against Black people and other minorities. So with the CHAZ gone, what comes next? We will discuss these and other issues tonight with longtime Seattle resident and former governor and U.S. Senator Dan Evans and James Donaldson, who played basketball for Washington State University before being selected by the Seattle SuperSonics in the NBA draft. Let's start the conversation by asking Governor Evans and James Donaldson what they think about the decline and fall of the CHAZ. Dan, let's start with you, and then we'll take James's comments.
I'm sorry, I'm still trying to get associated with this brand new kind of operation. You know, I'm an old pencil and paper guy. Repeat the question.
Sure, Dan. Just any thoughts you have about the CHAZ and what lessons we can learn from it, or what we think it means about larger issues in our country or in our city.
Well, I'm somewhat familiar with protests. I think the middle of my time as governor was a time of extraordinary protest, but it was not just focused on one set of issues. It was a protest against the war in Vietnam. It was a protest for civil rights, and it was a protest for better environmental stewardship. And all of those happened at approximately the same time. It was not really a joke, but we had the comment often in the governor's office, whose protest is it today? Because they were coming fast and furious and pretty good size for a city like Olympia.
Okay, and James, you spent some time at the CHAZ, I think, during the occupation and after, and I've read your, I guess, video blogging and some other things that you've written and posted. What do you think the CHAZ means for our city? The formation of it, what happened in the CHAZ, the end of it. What are your takeaways? James, can you hear us? Well, sounds like we don't have James on. Josh, is he on?
You see his picture.
See his picture, but he can't hear us.
Maybe muted.
Might be muted. Okay, well, we'll come back to him in a minute. Dan, let's continue with you since you can hear us. When we had you on our show several months ago, we talked about how Seattle and our state have had tough times before and used them as a springboard to create more economic opportunity for our citizens. We didn't get much of a chance to talk about the racial unrest of that period, and as you mentioned, all the protests. Protesters blocked the freeway back then like they are now. Josh, can we show that picture?
Yep, just 1 second here.
Yep, that's actually not today. That's in the early 1970s. And there was some violence around the state. We have a couple of pictures of the aftermath of the violence. That's how to fight and win in the street. I think there's another one, Josh, from the UW. Wage price controls. Yeah, there we go. A rough day at the UW. Some real violence there back then. Dan, let me ask you a few questions about what we can learn today that might help us today from the racial unrest that Seattle and other communities faced during a severe economic recession that we called the Boeing bust in the early 1970s. I think we just saw, and Josh, maybe you can bring up a picture of you as governor meeting with members of a Black organization leading some of the protests. Josh, do we have that one? You skipped by it there. There you go. Why did you think it was important as governor to meet with them when you were a statewide elected official and to be seen as doing so by the public at the time?
Well, it was, there were a number of groups. This was not easy to just focus on one set of leaders and say, okay, what can we do? There were many groups in many communities, and a good number of them chose to come to Olympia to make their protests right in the heart of the state government, and that was pretty intense. And in fact, what I do remember most about that whole series we had a whole series of meetings and confrontations, but I think one of the most important didn't bring me together with the leaders of any protest or any particular community. It was with a group of half a dozen teenagers, Black teenagers who were pretty intense in their protests. It was during the summer of 1969 or 1967, I guess, so it was earlier. And I just announced that I was going to come to the central area in Seattle to meet with people and to listen to their problems. I arrived and they had a small room set aside, a table in there, seated about 6, and off we started. And the first several were people who had individual problems, and I listened, and we got them hooked up with staff on the outside who could really handle their individual problems. We went on through the afternoon and finally staff member came in and said, "You've got 2 more groups." And they ushered in the second to last group of women, middle-aged at least, but dressed up in their fineries with gloves and all of that. They came in and I asked them, "Well, what are the problems?" He said, "We have no problem. We just wanted to welcome you to our community." And we had some tea and conversation, and it was, it was a very nice welcome into that community, which was at that time involved in a good many of the problems that we were facing. They invited in the last group, half a dozen teenagers. They came in and immediately started shouting about the problems they were facing. And pretty quickly, one young guy seated right across from me at the end of the table looked at me, put his finger up and pointed it at me with his thumb up and said, "Governor, if I had a gun right now, I'd shoot you." And that gets your attention pretty fast. And I finally gulped and said, "Well, what good would that do?" And he said, "One less honky to deal with." And that was enough for the rest of the teenagers. And they got up to go. And I said, "Look, you've talked about a lot of the things that are wrong. Why don't you come down to Olympia, meet with me, and I'll listen to you on what you think we ought to do about it. What are the right things to do?" Well, just as they got up to leave, one of the young guys said, "Governor, I'd like to invite you to our house for dinner tonight so you can see how we live." And I said, "I'd love to, but I've got another, meeting with several hundred people. But I'd very much like to do that." And with that, he looked at me and he says, "Well, I'll have to ask my mother first." And that changed things. They all left. I didn't think they would show up. They did. A week later, all dressed up, came into the governor's office, and we spent one of the best 2 hours that I have ever spent with these young people who had ideas and started out with a question. Why do we have to go 2 bus rides in one direction for a health department when we need help, and then 2 directions in the other direction, or 2 bus rides in the other direction for public assistance? And I said, "Well, that doesn't seem right, and we ought to bring in our staff and people and set up an office right in your neighborhood so that you have access to help for problems that you all have." And that sort of ended the meeting. But 30 days later, we opened the Central Area headquarters. And in the meantime, interestingly enough, the city of Seattle got involved. They wanted a desk. The federal government was involved. They wanted a desk in there. And so it became a headquarters, not just for state government, but for really several branches of government. And about a month later, we had a formal kind of opening ceremony. And the crowd was huge. The place was just jammed with people. And during the course of that meeting, an elderly woman came up to me and said, "Governor, how do you like our center?" And that was absolutely, in about 7 words, she captured the whole idea of what government ought to be about. It's not, she didn't say your center or government center or their center. She said our center. And that's what it all should be about. And that center worked very, very well. We had 2 young guys running it that We're responsible for hundreds of new jobs being created, new opportunities opened up, because it was viewed by people in the community as their center. And I think that's what today we've got to do, is figure out a way to bring people together on something that they can claim is our center, not just your or their or the government center. That's
So, Governor Evans, it sounds like in a relatively short period of time, you went from a us versus them mentality among at least some of the protesters, where, as you said, one of them said, if you had a gun, he'd shoot you, one less honky to worry about, to a sense of community that you were able to create where they viewed a government office as belonging to all of us or to all of them at the time, which maybe is a metaphor for where we should be moving things now. Let me just ask James Donaldson, can you hear me now? I know we were having some technical difficulties.
Yes, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're on with us. Great.
I got a video.
Pardon me? Yeah, we can see you.
Oh, good.
You're
Okay.
looking good.
Hey,
Yeah.
thanks, Governor. All right.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining us. Sorry for those technical issues. This is our 14th show, and we learn a new technical trick every week. Well, let me just go back to the question I asked Governor Evans, James, which is what's your takeaway from the end of the CHAZ? The creation, the continuance, and then the end of the CHAZ. I know you were up there a couple of times. I've read some of your blogs and your video blogs I've seen. What's your, in a minute or two, what's kind of your takeaway of that whole CHAZ episode, which is hopefully now behind us for good?
Yeah, hopefully. Well, I say it's about time and good riddance. The thing that was so appalling to me was our lack of response from our leaders, our elected officials and leaders around town, to just let that manifest and keep on brewing for over 30 days. It was bound to get turned bad. It was bound to go bad. I was up there 4 or 5 times doing little videos and little man on the spot reporting and things like that, just trying to get our elected leaders to step up and do something. You can't just let things play out and see what happens. Even last night or night before, we lost another young life on the freeways here in Seattle. One of the young protesters was down on the freeway and got hit by a car. And so these things are bound to turn out really bad if we don't maintain some sense of order, some sense of, control, some sense of structure, and some sense of respect for our leaders and our people who are supposed to be leading the way.
So just for those of you that are joining us, that was James Donaldson, former basketball star at Washington State University and was drafted by the Seattle SuperSonics and played in this city for a few years. He retired to Seattle, retired from basketball, and he's been a successful business owner, entrepreneur, and has been very active in Seattle politics. So, James, with that little bit of introduction, I think I've seen you calling for some change in city government. So let me just ask a broader question. What changes would you like to see in city, county, or state government in the wake of the CHAZ?
Well, my focus is really on the city government here in Seattle. This is where I live. I've been a big part of Seattle for 40 years, and I really pay attention to what's going on. I don't know if you remember, I ran for the office of mayor back in 2009 and ran for city council last summer, 2019. So I'm very involved with the political fabric of things that are going on and really know a lot of the people, connect with people well. I think my voice carries a little bit of weight when I speak about things because people know what I'm talking about. So I was calling for our mayor specifically, Mayor Jenny Durkin, to make a very difficult, tough decision. I know she's really emotionally tied to the Black Lives Matter movement folks and the LGBTQ community as well. But, you know, you cannot neglect the rest of the citizens of Seattle to really cater to and acquiesce to a small percentile of your overall population. And that's what I was getting upset about. I'm one of the 99.5% of the non-vocal majority. We don't say much. And that little 0.5% of a vocal minority took the city and ran with it and made us a laughingstock around the country for over 30 days.
Well, thank you, James. Let me go back to Dan Evans just for a second here, Dan, if you're still with us.
Sure.
In 1968, you ran as part of what was called the Action for Washington team with Attorney General candidate Slade Gorton, Secretary of State candidate Lud Kramer, and a Black City Council member from the Tri-Cities, Art Fletcher, running for Lieutenant Governor. We have a picture of that on the screen. I don't know if you can see it, the Action for Washington team. Art Fletcher would have been the first Black man elected to statewide office in Washington. What were you trying to do back then by including a Black man on that slate with you and the others?
Well, we wanted an action team that represented the state. And besides, Art Fletcher was an absolutely outstanding individual. He had come to the Tri-Cities area. He tried working with the community in Pasco, which was a tough thing to be able to do because they had extraordinary poverty, didn't seem to have too much opportunity available, and his attitude was, we don't want to be given anything, we want to earn things. But he was a charismatic leader, an extraordinary speaker. I've been at meetings listening to him speak, and he'd have people weeping, and 10 minutes later, the uproarious laughter of the audience was just an indicator that he was a tremendous communicator. He added markedly to that team effort in 1968 and came very close to winning the office of Lieutenant Governor, but ultimately lost. And I got a lesson after that election was over when I was approached by people after the election, particularly some women, some older women who said, "Governor, I just couldn't vote for I couldn't vote for anybody because that would make it so difficult for you." They actually, one woman said, "Look, I couldn't vote for him because if he got elected, I'm afraid that they," without saying who they were, she just said that they would assassinate you to have a Black man become governor. And it was totally just, I was unbelievably, I could not believe that people voted that way for that reason. And I don't know whether it was enough people to have made the difference, but he went on to a very successful time as an officer in the early days of the Nixon administration, and then later played a very important role in opening up opportunity for African American students in higher education. So he played a very big role in the turmoil that was plaguing us at that time, and in trying to bring some good out of it all. So he was a remarkable guy.
I think I've read that Art Fletcher, who you ran with in 1968, when he lost, he went on, as you mentioned, to the Nixon administration, and he's been dubbed the father of affirmative action for his work on programs to help Black and minority groups find economic opportunity. Dan, we didn't talk about this in advance of the show, but are you, I'm not supporting candidates in other races right now, but you have the luxury of doing that if you'd like. Are you supporting any particular candidate for governor right now?
Yes, I am. I think that at the, toward the end of filing date, Raul Garcia filed for governor, and I think he's a remarkable guy, a doctor, an emergency room doctor in Yakima, but he has ideas. He has a background that I think is would be very helpful, and I am backing him very strongly. I think that he would make a great Republican candidate and would make a great governor.
Okay, well, let's turn again to former Wazoo and Seattle SuperSonics basketball star James Donaldson. James, as I said earlier, you have been a successful business owner and you ran for Seattle mayor in 2009. I think you came in fourth behind Greg Nichols, who was the incumbent then.
Right.
Then I've read that you had a serious health issue in 2015, but you jumped back into politics last year. What is motivating you to re-engage in Seattle politics today?
Well, because I really care about this city. I really care about the communities around here. Through the 40 years I've been here, I've been very involved with the business community, the education and mentoring community, all the various ethnic communities around town, and sports and everything. So I've been really a big part of what's happening in Seattle the last 40 years. I really care about it. Basketball has taken me all over the world and allowed me to live in some fantastic cities around the world. But Seattle's always been home. And I always came home to Seattle after every basketball season. And I chose to make my home here. So I choose to stay here and be part of what's going on. Politics, I believe, is really the only avenue that you can seriously get things done. You have a seat at the table. You're part of the decision-making process. Sometimes, unfortunately, part of the sausage-making process as well. But that's what it takes, to put legislation in place that people can really be excited about, be proud about, and live up to. And this is how you guide and lead people along the way. We need more good people in politics. It's a shame it's gotten to be such a dirty game now. I don't like to play dirty, and I don't purposely play dirty at all for anything. But overall, you look at the national level and the state and the local levels of politics, it can get to be a tough chore for anybody who is really well qualified and could be doing a great job. Too many of them shy away from it because of those aspects.
Let me pick up on your don't play dirty comment. The great Seattle sports writer Art Thiel wrote an article for the Athletic. I was going to say Atlantic, but I think the Athletic. Yeah. And he either called you or quoted people as saying, not that you were a dirty player, but you were a cerebral player, very smart in how you approached it. So let me ask you this. What do you think are the big issues that Seattle needs to address so that its residents no longer believe that they are losing control of the city that they love?
Well, I think we need to really regain control of our societal fabric, so to speak. You see protests all over now, and some of it just and some of it peaceful. A lot of it is vandalism and looting and rioting and just causing a scene because they can. I'm totally supportive of our police force. I'd like to see a strong, capable, fair police force out there at all times, protecting and serving us all. And so that's what we need to be able to unshackle, to take the handcuffs off our police department and our police chief to be able to do the job. Our mayor shied away from any confrontation against any of the rioters and things that happened downtown Seattle about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I mean, the city went up in flames, vehicles were burning, windows were broken. It was a total mess, and it never had to happen. I mean, with good police presence who are there to just protect the properties and the lives of so many, that could have been totally avoided. And the whole thing up at CHOP could have been totally avoided as well.
Okay, now for both Governor Dan Evans and James Donaldson, how do you think our state should be addressing the racial justice issues that have been highlighted by the George Floyd murder? I know it's kind of a open-ended question, but I kind of want your open-ended response. Dan, let's take you first. What do you think our state should do to respond to the racial justice issue?
Well, you know, in the series of protests we had, and I talk about series of protests, my whole time as governor was a time of extraordinary activism, and we had protests so often that we almost had to schedule them. But there was a difference, I think, in those protests and what I've seen, at least, happening in Seattle in the last few weeks. And that was that the protests of that era were focused. I don't get the impression that they're as focused now. They talk about all Black Lives Matter, and that's okay, but that's a statement of the problem, not a statement of how to cure what is viewed as a problem. The people that I remember on campus and in the city and throughout the state protested, but there were two things that distinguished them. They generally had leaders in the protest that could speak for the protesting group, and the protests were focused on one issue or a fairly narrow set of issues with some ideas of what ought to happen. And it seems to me that that's what, successful protests going back over, an extraordinarily long history. If you distinguish between the successful and the unsuccessful, it's almost always a protest against a perceived evil, but it carries with it some ideas about what the alternative should be, how you cure the evil. A protest that is just a protest doesn't get you very far. Protest may start you off on looking towards solutions, but if you have no idea what the solution should be, or have no statement about that, it's not very effective. So I think that's where we're missing today. Those protests, as I saw them in Seattle, were protests almost for the sake of protest. Sure, they talked about Black Lives Matter, and they were in response to the Floyd murder, but I didn't hear much about what we should be doing, and some ideas for more permanent solutions. And that's got to be part of a successful protest. If you don't have that, you don't have very much.
And James Donaldson, back to you. How do you think our state should be moving forward in addressing the racial justice issues that there's been a lot of protest about, but as Governor Evans points out, other than defund the police, which is, I guess you could say, a plan, not in my view very practical.
Not really.
Not a lot of a plan, and maybe not visible leadership. It might be there, but not visible. How do you think our state should be moving forward on these issues?
Well, this is a multifaceted situation that we're in. Even the protests that began after George Floyd's murder weren't so much, I don't think, about the murder of George Floyd. I think he was the catalyst, the ignition that lit it all going. I mean, people had been sheltering in place for 3 months. They had lost their jobs. They had lost their income. They don't know if they're ever going back to a job. Their kids were out of school for half the school year. They're frustrated. They're pent up. They're angry. And this really gave so many people, 40 million people unemployed, who don't have a job to go to tomorrow, a reason to get out in the streets and just go crazy. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen white people, especially in a looting situation, breaking a plate glass window, walking through the plate glass, picking up a good out of a luxury store, staring right at the camera and walking off. I've never seen that before. But this affected everybody. This pandemic is affecting everybody in a lot of different ways. You know, you see my shirt here. It's an All Lives Matter shirt. And I wear this everywhere I go. And it really begins a conversation, because I think for so many white folks, especially, they feel that they can have a conversation with me wearing this kind of shirt rather than a Black Lives Matter shirt. I think All Lives Matter is a unifying statement. Black Lives Matter is a divisive statement. It's us and them. You're either with us or you're against us. But when you're all together, everybody has to be together. We've been all together in this pandemic. Why can't we be all together in this racial protest? And racial issues also lend themselves to the fact that we don't know each other very well across the racial lines and boundaries, especially. I remember with the Greater Seattle Chamber of Commerce 15, 20 years ago, we used to have a series of racial conversations called Forum on Race. And once a quarter, we'd have distinguished national speakers come out and speak to a group of 500-600 people in a room, a lot of them business people. And the purpose was to sit at a table of 10 next to someone who didn't look like you. We had stacks of questions on the table. You know, what are some of your stereotypes about another race? Have you ever had a Black person over to your home for dinner? Those kind of things, just to get the conversation going. And great speakers like Yolanda King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter, Michael Eric Dyson, Ben Carson, Morris Dees. I mean, we had a lot of great speakers coming through. And this was really a great thing to have on an ongoing basis, because for many folks, for the first time, they're sitting next to somebody and actually having a conversation with somebody who doesn't look like them. And it's eye-opening. It's bringing walls down. It's building bridges, which is what I'm all about. And so I think we need to continue, you know, stepping outside of our comfort zone a little bit, engage in a conversation with someone who doesn't look like you, doesn't have the same experience as you, and really see what that person's all about, and let them get to see who you are as well. That will go a long, long ways. Right now, I hope we can get this genie back in the bottle. Race has been plaguing our country from the very beginning. I'm running an ongoing series on Facebook every single day, The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow. A lot of people don't remember about Jim Crow, but that was another 100 years after slavery of oppression and segregation and keeping Black folks down and out and not being able to compete on an equal playing field. That was Jim Crow. And so every day I'm running a little 3-minute video on Facebook for people to just get a grasp of something about what that's all about. So I think that we can still make inroads and keep on going down this pathway we've been going down. But we need to do it together. We need to do it. You know, we got to bring these divides down and really come together. And this is the reason for my All Lives Matter t-shirt. It includes Black lives as well, red lives, LGBTQ lives, yellow lives, you name it. Everybody is included when I wear this t-shirt.
You probably have not heard this story, but some of our viewers have. When I was going to law school on the south side of Chicago, which is a mostly Black part of town, I interviewed for and was hired as the first white person hired by an entirely Black law firm. All the lawyers were Black and all the staff were Black. And I was hired because I was white. And of course, I like to think I was qualified for the job, and I probably was, but I asked the patron of the firm, the great Don Hubert, why did you want to hire a white guy? This was a part-time clerking job while I was in school. And just to your point, James, he said, I wanted my staff mostly who don't know any white people to get to know a white person. The lawyers had been to law school, they knew white people, but my staff didn't. And he said, I think that's an important step that we can all take to bridging the racial divide is just getting to know each other. And it was such a wonderful experience for me. I'd love to tell that story. Well, let me move to another topic. Our state is named for the first president of the United States, George Washington. He's been called the indispensable man for his actions in the Revolutionary War and to help create the United States as we know it today. But he was also a slaveholder. So some are calling for his statues to be taken down and his name removed from schools. In fact, protesters in Portland, Oregon toppled a George Washington statue last week.
Yeah.
Dan, your name is on the school of a public policy school at a university named for George Washington, and you are also governor of the state named for him. What do you say to those who want to take his name and statutes away? Dan, this is for you first.
Well, I think that you start with the fact that no one is perfect. And people today who look back in history often look back with the knowledge of today and and look back in history and try to apply today's knowledge to history of several hundred years ago. And that's, I think, inappropriate. You have to recognize what the country was like at the time. Yes, George Washington did have slaves, as did virtually everyone else in Virginia. But he also led the country during an extraordinary period of time, a fight for freedom and a fight for independence. And he stayed with his troops at Valley Forge. He lost more battles than he won during the war, but he never gave up. And the view of people around him at that time was that he was the indispensable leader, the one that everyone could coalesce around. And if you're in a battle, if you're in a war, or James, I think if you're even on a sports team, it sure helps to have someone who can coalesce the group and make an extraordinary fighting force out of them. George Washington did all of that. And most importantly, he set a standard that was an extraordinary one for a brand new country. At the end of 2 years, or two terms as president, he stepped down and he said, and I'm sure he could have gotten reelected for a third term easily. And there was talk during the debates on independence about whether he should be, or whether someone should be the king rather than a president who was subject to reelection. But he set standards that have lasted to this day. And I think those who want to topple his statue on the basis that he was a slaveholder are simply not thinking very deeply about his whole personality, his whole lifetime of leadership, and how he really gave, in many respects, birth to this country.
Mm-hmm.
So James, let me ask you the same question. What do you think about this movement to take down the names and the statutes of some of the founding fathers who were also slaveholders?
Well, there's a mantra going around now with a lot of the protesters around the country that say, if we don't get what we want, we're going to burn the whole system down. And that's just pure anarchy and just craziness, really, when it comes down to it. This is a slippery slope that we're getting on with these topplings of statue. Frederick Douglass's statue just got torn down yesterday as well.
Yeah.
This is incredible. We live in a democracy, and in a democracy, majority rules. Perhaps we should put on the ballot every 5 years for a local community or region to vote on whether a statue stays up in public or it gets taken down and moved to a museum and put away for safekeeping and for viewing in a museum with a historical perspective. That's the way you do things. I mean, it's civil, it's fair. Every 5 years, maybe the mindset's changed a little bit, and that's okay. But just outright looting and vandalism and painting of statues and toppling them. Wow, I mean, I feel like I'm living in some Eastern Bloc country back in World War I and II. That's not us. We are so much better than that. And we have to really get a grip on ourselves. I don't know exactly what it is the end game will be for the protesters and what they're protesting about, what changes they want to make. I think so far, everything has been symbolic so far since George Floyd murder. Everything except for the Democrats and the Republicans agreeing that lynching should be a federal crime. Good. That should have happened 150 years ago, at least.
Right.
But finally, it's a federal crime. That's the only thing we've agreed on. Other than that, everything has been purely symbolic. The murals, the painting, the statues toppling, it's been just purely symbolic, and it doesn't amount to anything yet.
Okay, well, let's close with the last.
Go
ahead, Dan.
James has captured it beautifully.
Thank you.
It's just, he's absolutely right. We've got to get beyond some of this symbolism and really think about what's necessary to make things right. And that's not it.
No, that's right.
Well, and if you haven't read a good biography on George Washington, I really recommend it. He's been caricatured, but he personally detested the institution of slavery. And in his will, and upon his death, he released his slaves into freedom. He released them from their bondage. So there's really a complete story there about him. It's quite remarkable, and I really recommend it. Well, let me finish with a question to both of you. There are 30 plus candidates for governor. There's 4 candidates for attorney general. There's multiple candidates for other statewide positions. Of course, I'm running for attorney general. Do you have any advice for candidates for statewide office like me about how we can advance the cause of racial justice, even in our campaigns, and then once we're elected to office? Just any closing thoughts on that? Let's see, we'll start with James and then Dan will go to you.
Yeah. Well, as much as I hate this phrase, but I would say my advice to you and other folks running statewide is to stay woke, okay? Stay woke, meaning be aware of the privileges you have because you're a white Caucasian male or female. You have tremendous privileges built in. And when you go around to communities that don't have those privileges, that are disadvantaged and underutilized, there's a reason for that. And you have benefited from the legacy of slavery. Be woke, be sensitive to those facts. Talk to people about it. I get some of the best conversations from some of my elders at church, 80 and 90-year-old African-American men and women. My dad is 94 years old, still living, but he will not talk about his early years of growing up in Indiana, KKK country, when he was 20 and 25 years old. He will not talk about it. So these stories are real. The police brutalities have been real throughout the years. Now it's getting captured on videotapes and cameras, and that's great. But this has been going on for 100, 200 years. Even through my Jim Crow series, there were 1,000 lynchings a year for years and years and years, and nobody said a thing. Matter of fact, it was a Sunday gathering picnic affair for a lot of white communities to watch a black man being hung from a tree. Stay woke is my advice, and reach out and try to have a conversation. with someone who doesn't look like you and doesn't have your same life experiences.
Good advice. And I may come back to you and have you help me meet members of your church and others. James Donaldson, former Seattle SuperSonic. My first love in sports was the Seattle SuperSonics when they were a new team in town. And Dan Evans, you get the last word here on this. Advice to statewide candidates like me running for Attorney General on how we can help in this conversation, both as candidates and once we're elected to office.
Well, I think James captured it very well. I will only add that when I was a youngster, a teenager, my grandfather lived with our family. And I remember listening to him once saying, you've got 2 ears to listen with and 1 mouth to talk. So you ought to listen twice as much as you talk. And I think that's very, very good advice right now for people in power to listen, people running for office to listen. And that's different than hearing. I remember one of my friends who said he was a political guy, and he said, "Oh yeah, I hear everybody." And I said, "No, that's not what I'm talking about. There's a big difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is you just hear whatever it is somebody's saying. Listening is trying to understand what they're saying and why. And we don't do much listening in this country. We do a lot of talking, but we don't do enough listening."
That's right. Wow.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for joining our show today. And I want to thank all our viewers and listeners for watching what is our 14th live stream supper show. When we started this program, everyone was in lockdown, and we thought we'd make a few shows before normal campaigning began again. Well, we're not there yet, but I've been so pleased and a little bit surprised to hear how many of you try to watch each week. Our show has even inspired some of you to try your hand at making your own live stream show. I was on one of those shows last week. We have and are continuing to create a community of citizens who care deeply about our state, who want to see pragmatic and balanced solutions to the challenges we face. Many of you have asked if we would make podcasts available of our shows. With the help of my son, Grant, we have posted podcasts of 4 shows on the main sites like Apple's podcast app, Stitcher, and Google Play. You can find them by searching for my name, Mike Vaska. We'll make more shows available over the coming weeks. Thank you for watching and for your support to my Attorney General campaign. To learn more about that and to join our team to protect the Evergreen State, please go to my website, www.mikevaska.com.